A German Air Force plane on its way to New York. Its secret mission? To carry out Hitler's final plan of destruction and transform the skyline of New York into a towering inferno.
During the planning and development of World War II, Adolf Hitler literally dreamed of seeing his enemies burn. While asleep, they were just dreams, but when he woke up, he worked to make them a reality. Thus was born the America Bomber, an ambitious project aimed at creating a long-range bomber capable of traveling almost 12,000 kilometers with a payload large enough to devastate the city of New York in the United States. The soldiers were willing to embark on this virtually suicidal mission, as long as they inflicted massive damage on their rival. In this new military history video, we will explore everything behind this brutal initiative that was on the verge of coming to fruition, the most impressive prototypes, and what might have happened if the Führer's wish had detonated on American soil.
(1937). Hitler has been in power for 4 years. The scenario of a coming world war is already taking form. Hitler begins seeking contact with the Air Force. It will play a special role in his plans to conquer the world.
On April 4, 1941, the former Japanese Minister of Foreign Affairs, Yosuke Matsuoka, visited Berlin, where he met with Hitler to discuss relations between the two Axis powers. During the conversation, the Führer reiterated his idea of supporting the Asian country if it went to war with the United States. He even assured his counterpart that German submarines, known as U-boats, and their feared air force, the Luftwaffe, would attack targets on American soil. These words were well received by the Japanese official, although they sounded more like a wish than a possible reality, despite the intended support. However, as implausible as the idea seemed, there was a long history behind what the Nazi leader had said. The Germans had been developing a significant effort within their aviation industry to equip the Air Force with a strategic long-range bomber. The great aspiration was for it to be capable of attacking the continental United States. In fact, the goal was even more precise. Hitler wanted to devastate New York City. The idea of destroying such an emblematic target also included the possibility of going after major industrial centers on the East Coast. Nevertheless, regardless of the final target, everything pointed to the same place. It was necessary to have aircraft with great flying range, a goal that had started to develop shortly after the Nazis came to power. The driving force behind this was Walther Wever, the Chief of Staff of the newly created German Air Force. Under his direction, work began on a project named Ural Bomber. The initiative, conceived for a future war with the Soviet Union, studied how to attack Soviet industries in the Urals from the air. However, Wever died on June 3, 1936, and the new Luftwaffe commanders opted for tactical bombers, which were smaller and had shorter ranges than strategic bombers, to operate in coordination with ground troops to support them in their campaigns. That decision was not misguided, as this work would become one of the cornerstones of Blitzkrieg, the source of German successes in the early years of the conflict that ravaged the world from 1939 to 1945. The focus had changed, but the German aviation sector wanted to prove it could build transatlantic aircraft. This required million-dollar agreements, so they needed to be convincing enough to justify dedicating resources to the idea.
In 1937, Hitler visited the Messerschmitt facilities in Augsburg, where he was presented with a 4-engine long-range bomber prototype. It was touted as being capable of reaching the United States East Coast from Western Europe.
On one hand, the Luftwaffe would be equipped with tactical bombers, whose characteristics made them ideal support for troops deployed in the European theater of operations. This way, the Nazi forces could attack key points from the air to cause the maximum number of casualties, and with the defenses weakened, ground advances could follow. Meanwhile, several companies were hoping to secure contracts for other types of aircraft classified as strategic, such as the renowned Messerschmitt. These bombers were larger, with unprecedented range for the time, and could potentially make the Führer's dreams a reality. Nevertheless, the challenge was significant. Despite the developers' efforts, prototypes like the 4-engine bomber presented by Willy Messerschmitt to the Nazi leader required additional support to meet the goal. In theory, that aircraft could cover 6,000 kilometers with the capacity to carry nearly a ton of bombs. With such a range, an attack on American soil could be considered, but it would be necessary to have bases in places like the French coast or the Azores. Although Hitler was impressed with the project, under the insistence of Hermann Göring, the commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe, other possibilities were explored, such as the design of the Junkers Ju-88. This was a fast, twin-engine bomber that would be less costly to produce, reducing risks in terms of time and material availability. Another demonstration of German capabilities in this regard occurred on August 11, 1938. A passenger aircraft, the FW-200 Condor, completed a direct flight between Berlin and New York, marking a clear precursor to Hitler's plans. The aircraft was from the Focke-Wulf Company, which would play a crucial role in World War II as the creator of combat aircraft like the FW-190 fighter. The arrival of this flight was a notable achievement reported by the American press, and the U.S. military also took note of the Reich's aeronautical feat. Although the plane that landed in New York was commercial, military variants would soon be developed. However, with the need to carry weapons and other equipment, they knew that range would be reduced for crossing the Atlantic, as increased weight with the same engine power meant less range. In addition to this simple math that provided some reassurance to the Americans, Hitler also maintained a cordial relationship with Washington, though he was never as convincing as he had hoped.
He was a wolf in lamb's clothing and pretended to want peace.
Und hier erkläre ich feierlichst, dass alle irgendwie verbreiteten Behauptungen über einen beabsichtigten deutschen Angriff oder Eingriff auf oder in amerikanische Gebiete plumper Schwindel oder grobe Unwahrheit sind.
Hitler's word was not considered a really reliable word. So, in spite of telling Roosevelt that he would never invade or be aggressive against America, no one believed him.
The outbreak of World War II made it clear that the Führer's intentions were not to make friends, but to conquer as much territory as possible. Beyond that, it also highlighted the strengths and weaknesses of the Luftwaffe. The German Air Force failed to subdue Britain during the Battle of Britain, which took place from July to October 1940. This was perhaps their greatest failure, not only due to the bravery of the British pilots, but also because of the lack of German aircraft capable of attacking with confidence. The resistance of the Royal Air Force was just a first warning, and the Reich's military confirmed these shortcomings during the campaign against the Soviet Union. There, they helplessly watched as major industrial centers, which Stalin had ordered moved to the Urals, fell outside their reach. The idea proposed by the late Wever many years earlier was indeed well-founded. As the conflict progressed, in addition to their problems on the battlefield with the British and Soviets, Hitler grew increasingly concerned about the role the United States might play. Both the Führer and his generals knew that the likelihood of a confrontation with the American power was rising, and they began to consider the occupation of strategic territories in the Atlantic, such as the Canary Islands or the Azores, a Portuguese archipelago particularly interesting to Germany. From there, if they could deploy long-range bombers, they could attack ports on the east coast of the United States. Even simply establishing Nazi bases could serve as a deterrent to prevent the American giant from entering the war. Until achieving a conquest that would meet this end, the German leader ordered his forces not to initiate direct conflict with the Americans, avoiding any aggression that might occur on the battlefields during the conflict. An example of this occurred in the oceans, where Washington's ships were transporting cargo to their allies.
The shipping routes in the Atlantic become a theater of war. German submarines begin torpedoing English freighters. Hitler expressly forbids his navy from attacking American ships. Under no circumstances does he wish to provoke the United States, not until he has finished preparations for a war with the American superpower.
However, this stance changed dramatically on December 11, 1941. 4 days after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States decided to enter the conflict, accelerating Hitler's plans. True to his word with the Asian Empire, Germany declared war on the Americans at the Führer's direction. In this context, Willy Messerschmitt informed the Nazi leader that his bomber prototype was in an advanced stage. It was designated the Me-264, and the engineer claimed it had a range of 11,600 kilometers, enough for a round-trip flight to New York. In light of this news, during the spring of 1942, the Luftwaffe tasked Colonel Dietrich Schwenke, in charge of test flights, with preparing a report on the feasibility of having an aircraft to attack the United States. From then on, this project was known as the America Bomber. Despite the good relationship Hitler had established with Messerschmitt, the initiative was not awarded directly to his company. Instead, a much broader range of options was explored to find the design that best met German needs. This certainly involved a detailed analysis of the aircraft's performance, but also considered other factors such as materials, costs, and time delays. Despite all this, the idea excited the Führer. Obsessed with dominating his rivals and the possibility of reducing them to ashes, Hitler's plans also hit another interest that could change the course of history.
Hitler was personally fascinated by the thought of setting New York City ablaze. He believed that the United States would be forced out of the war thanks to a series of well-planned attacks. Hitler almost had an obsession with enemy cities, often entertaining himself with films of explosions in enemy territories or fires in places such as Warsaw and London.
The Luftwaffe's idea for the America bombers was not to carry out massive attacks. Instead, the Nazis aimed for a psychological impact. The plan was to frighten the American population and force Washington to allocate more military resources to defend the East Coast. Essentially, the goal was to divert attention from the European fronts and pull the US out of the battle to continue with German conquest. Certainly, if a bombing like the one Hitler imagined had struck New York, the outcome of the war could have been very different, or at least its resolution would have been considerably delayed. However, despite everything seeming perfect, executing such a plan was complex. Colonel Schwenke's report was completed on April 27, 1942. As an alternative to a hypothetical occupation of the Azores, it was proposed to use a point on the French Atlantic coast, such as Brest, located 5,500 kilometers from the chosen target. In addition to the Me-264, other models were considered, including the aforementioned FW-200, the Heinkel He-277, the Junkers Ju-290, and the Blohm & Voss BV-222 Viking. With this list of contenders, the intense race among manufacturers to realize the America bomber began. The plan they were to follow also set a series of objectives. With New York at the forefront, they aimed to attack other industrial centers in North Carolina, Tennessee, or Pennsylvania. The vast majority of developers began to face problems in meeting these goals. After all, the absence of an aircraft with the requested specifications was due to the fact that a project of this type was not easy to accomplish. Ultimately, the Heinkel He-277 emerged as the main competitor to the Me-264 in this race. It was an evolution of the He-177, the only long-range bomber in the Reich's arsenal, which is why it was decided that experienced German pilots of that model would be responsible for testing the new variant. Additionally, there was confidence in these soldiers' commitment to undertake any future mission that involved venturing into American territory, despite the risks involved.
We were willing to fly any mission, but we did hope to have at least a small chance of surviving.
Hitler's insane dream was to use suicide attacks to bring the superpower United States to its knees.
Terror. I'll lay my own life on the line, 100%, if it means I can kill many times as many people someplace else.
I think he dreamed of the whole city just disappearing in a firestorm.
From their testimonies, we can discern that the pilots were not the masterminds behind the idea of bombing New York, but at some point, they had joined the Luftwaffe and were now conducting aircraft tests for a plan with an uncertain outcome. Initially, their task was to test various modifications that German aeronautical engineers were making to Heinkel 177 aircraft. They aimed to adapt the bomber to achieve a range of 12,000 kilometers, the distance required to travel from Berlin to the skies over New York, drop bombs on Manhattan, and return to Europe. The standard model had a flight range of 6,500 kilometers, so the goal was to nearly double that. The idea was to conserve fuel during the journey through a series of modifications to the engines, reach the target, and return, provided they weren't shot down beforehand. The pilots trained by flying at high altitudes, navigating solely by the sun and stars to reduce the chance of detection. Another challenge was taking off and landing with these aircraft, which was very difficult due to the structural changes being made. Additionally, the modified engines tended to catch fire easily, which cost the lives of some pilots assigned to the mission. Each change in test always faced the same result: failure. This led engineers to explore new approaches while the logistics of the operation also evolved. Meanwhile, the war continued, and Hitler's plan faced a race against time, with Germany's lack of funds becoming a problem for sustaining the conflict and addressing the losses. Despite making significant progress, only a few parts of the He-277 were produced. Other options either required increased capabilities or remained on the drawing board. The only model that eventually achieved some success was the Me-264.
As far as I know, the task was to achieve 11,000 kilometers and a load capacity of 3 tons. That was something no other airplane had ever been able to do, but the Me-264 was very close to accomplishing it.
3 units of the Messerschmitt aircraft were built, and they underwent several test flights starting on December 23, 1942. About 30 aircraft were expected to be produced, but to the Führer's disappointment, the America bomber project would not progress much further. By 1943, the tide of the war began to change. Germany saw its resources dwindling and had to focus on the defense of the Reich. Additionally, the Normandy landings in June 1944 deprived Hitler of the bases on the French coast from which his powerful aircraft were to take off. A final blow to the project came on July 8, 1944. The Third Reich's Minister of Armaments, Albert Speer, ordered the prioritization of fighter production over bombers. The Me-264 would ultimately not enter production.
It made no sense. I mean, in war plans, you plan everything. And then comes the problem of priorities. Do you have the ability, do you have the equipment, do you have the people, do you have the resources to do it? And are those resources being used for the best purpose or not?
Hitler's ambitions seemed to be fading. He had to bet everything he had left on other fronts if he still hoped to maintain the prospect of victory. To make matters worse, Messerschmitt's factories suffered significant attacks, and the aircraft prototypes were destroyed, along with large quantities of components. Although discussions continued about developing even more advanced models than the Me-264 and He-277, such as the jet bomber Arado E-555 or the Ho-88 flying wing designed by the Horten brothers, nothing came to fruition. Another of these innovative designs was the Silber-Vogel rocket bomber, or Silverbird, by engineer Eugen Zenger. It was a suborbital aircraft that theoretically could reach speeds of over 21,000 kilometers per hour in the stratosphere. However, none of this came to pass. The war ended for Germany in May 1945, and no prototype was produced in mass. The America bomber project remained in the theoretical realm and in the dreams of Nazis hoping for a miracle in the final stages of the conflict. In conclusion, we can determine from this analysis that a bombing of New York could have been a major shock to the world amid the most brutal war of the last century. However, we will never know the impact it could have had if it had been realized. And now, it's time to say goodbye. Thank you very much for joining us. We look forward to seeing you in our next episode of Military History.